Welcome, everyone. My name is Jacob Nias. I'm a cattleman from Leesburg, Georgia, and currently serve as the Executive Committee Representative of NCBA's Young Beef Leader Advisory Group. NCBA's Young Beef Leader program is focused on educating, networking, and developing the next generation of beef industry leaders through engagement with NCBA's state and breed affiliated organizations and through incorporation into industry meetings and events. I have the privilege of serving alongside 7 regional representatives who make up the steering committee: Austin Art, Ryan Miller, Keith Bryant, Jason Small, Eamon O'Toole, Will Mayfield, and Zach Pogue. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to submit your questions in the chat box on your screen. At the end of the presentation, questions will be moderated by our presenter. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available in a few days at beefusa.org. On behalf of YBL's education series, we're pleased to present The Conflict Industry and You with Bruce Benson. Bruce is a third-generation logger from Libby, Montana. He speaks throughout the U.S. and world, testifies on resource issues before Congress, and appeared on several programs such as 60 Minutes. Bruce has been named Timberman of the Year in Montana, National Forest Activist of the Year, received the inaugural Presidential Preserve America Award from President Bush, has been named Keeper of the 10th by Women in Farm Economics, and received American Agri-Women's Veritas Award, just to name a few. Bruce and his wife of 41 years, Patty Jo, have 4 children and 11 grandchildren. His current activities represent a family commitment to responsible environmentalism. During this evening's webinar, Bruce will take an in-depth look at the strategies of businesses built on a 3-world vision of stop doing that, and discuss ideas on developing counter strategies that work and are fun to implement. Tonight, you'll learn about the conflict industry and you, and the questions that you should be asking as you progress as a leader. This evening's webinar is brought to you by NCBA's Young Beef Leader program and our corporate sponsor, Caterpillar. I'll now turn it over to Bruce.
Tonight's webinar is going to be a look at the conflict industry that we've dealt with in the timber industry and what that might mean to you. To give you a little bit better idea how I've come to the ideas, my conclusions, I'll give you a little bit more background on where I'm from. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Libby, Montana, but it's a town of about 2,800 up in the brush of northwestern Montana between Glacier Park and Idaho, up against the Canadian border. Stunningly beautiful place to call home. The family actually came west from Missouri in the 1850s. Some landed in eastern Oregon and became ranchers. Some of those ranchers moved to Montana, and some of us figured out that cows don't eat trees, so we became tree whackers, the loggers. I still got family involved in both ranching and logging. Now, we share the ecosystem that I live in with a bunch of charismatic megafauna that America is in love with, grizzly bears and moose and elk and those kind of things. It hasn't always been a comfortable coexistence because the area was actually started by timber barons. They moved from Minnesota, and those were the old cut and run days, and they really did cut and run. It was acceptable to do that at that time because we were, as a society, we were very committed to subduing the wilderness and civilizing the continent. So they were pretty rough. It was rough on the ground. It was rough on people. But it was the way they did business. It's not the same anymore. My job in the forest industry when I was putting myself through college was being a tree cutter. We call him a sawyer. That's the guy who does the actual tree whacking. We don't do that much anymore. Now we have machinery just like the rest of commodity production. The machines cost $250,000 to $500,000 a piece. But they're easier on the operators, they're easier on the ground, and they're way more efficient. The biggest change, though, and it was learned by the timber barons that started my town, they decided that if they wanted to commit themselves to forestry for the long term, someone else had already been in Idaho and Washington, the previous timber barons, so they decided that they needed to start figuring out how to stay in one place, and that meant planting trees. So they started a sustainable forestry program. They planned a 200-year management plan for our town and started planting 6 trees for every one that they harvested. It was unique because that was in the 1920s and 30s, and the World Commission on Forestry still studies our area to figure out how they were doing it and what worked and what didn't. But since that time, we've been pretty enthusiastic about our conservation and stewardship because not only are we planting, but most of America doesn't know we have more trees now than we did in 1900 at the turn of that century. A lot of it is because of our forestry practices that have changed, planting. Now, the other reason is production agriculture is now using less acres to make the same amount of food, and those marginal acres that used to try to grow things like corn and cotton have gone back to what God and nature intended them to be, and that's largely in America, trees. So we have reforested a bunch of America, and that was supposed to give me great hope and my kids great hope for their future. This is the family. You can see that's a nice, beautiful shot of Montana on the 4th of July. You'll notice there's a cowboy hat in there. One of my daughters married a cowboy. They live in Miles City. My other daughter married a forester, and they live in Libby. I have a son there that married a cowgirl. He lives in Bozeman. And another son that is a logger and our state senator. Our great hope for handing off Vincent logging to the next generation has met with some troubles. Something is wrong in resource communities. And what I want to talk with you about a bit tonight is what I think happened to us and how we got introduced to the conflict industry. And why should you listen to a logger? We share a lot of things. We share things like a heritage of conservation and stewardship. We have a deep-seated love of the environment that we're managing, just like ranchers do. We also share customs and cultures. After graduating from Gonzaga University with a couple of degrees, I wanted to raise my family in this culture, the rural American culture. It's full of hardworking, hard-playing, community-oriented, family-oriented, church-oriented, school-oriented people. And I wanted to raise my family in that. And a logging town is no different than a ranching or a farming town. The deep cultural customs that we enjoy are what I wanted my kids to have. We also share an industry makeup. Most people, when they think of the timber industry, they think of Weyerhaeuser or Georgia Pacific, but 97% of the timber industry are family corporations, ma and pa outfits like Vincent Logging that was started by my parents and ultimately grew to include 65 other families. So we share that. Our industry makeup is we have some that are vertically integrated and own everything from the forest to the sawmill to the marketing plan. A lot of others, just like in cattle, there are people like me, we don't own the land that we manage, but we harvest the trees and then send them to a processing plant owned by someone else. So our industries are made up very similarly. Right now, though, we share one big reality. We only operate with the consent of the public. It's called the social license. And if that license is removed, they will figure out how to put us out of business through regulatory reforms. Our license was debated starting about 30 years ago, and we lost that debate. And that's where I learned about the conflict industry and what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong. In tonight's webinar, I'm going to go quickly over where I think we are in dealing with them, how I think we got to where we're at, what is the conflict industry, and what can we do about it? Where are we? We're having in rural America what I call a collision of visions. And we're having this collision because for the last 50 years, our society has had two things that humans had never had before. time and money. And what they've been doing with their 2-week summer vacation is blowing out of places like Atlanta, Seattle, Chicago, Los Angeles, and coming to our rural areas and communing with us. And what do you know? They've been falling in love. They're falling in love with the very things we love about living where we live. Clean air, clean water, abundant wildlife. Those are things that they thought had been lost. They get 200 channels of bad news now, and they thought we'd already destroyed things that they're now seeing outside their rental car window, and they're falling in love. They're loving the same things we love. We expect clean air, clean water, and abundant wildlife right outside of our door. They're seeing it for the first time, and they want to save it. They even love our cultures. They have no idea what makes us tick. But I can tell you, if there's somebody from Seattle driving through Montana on I-90 at 85 miles an hour and they see a cowboy, they will slide to a stop on the freeway. Oh, honey, look, a cowboy. They have no idea what makes us tick, but they see the hat and they fall in love with that. But at the end of their 2 weeks, they have to go home, and they have to go home to their urban jungle. And when they leave with a desire, and it's a desire we all understand. It's a desire to protect. They want to save the last best places. I got to see it up close and personal because the public wants to save the forest. And I don't blame them. I want to save it too. And when I found out that they were that concerned about the forest, I thought, well, cool. The truth is on our side. How could we possibly lose this discussion? But America doesn't know much about forestry. They think when they come to look at our hills, this is a drainage behind my house, they think, well, that's a healthy forest. Look, all the trees and it's green. What they don't know is that 15,000 years ago, it didn't look like that. 15,000 years ago, it had a mile of ice over it. There were no trees. The ice has melted, which is why I don't argue with people about global warming. I think we've warmed up. I don't think it was cow farts that did it, but the ice left, and as the ice was leaving, Native Americans followed the receding ice cap, and when they came in, trees weren't their friend. They got in their way for travel. They couldn't see their prey. They couldn't see their enemies. So in areas like where I live, they would come in their nomadic ways, and they would consume the ungulates that they ate in the area, and then they light it on fire to remove the trees and the brush. And they knew that in 10 or 12 years, they could come back and the area would be healthy. It would be full of grass and it'd be full of the things they eat. So for thousands of years, they've been burning our forest. They've been managing. In the 1820s, we removed them and their management from the landscape. And when we did, those trees that were killed by intermittent fires stopped being killed. And what we ended up with was a forest that has too many trees. And when a forest has too many trees, they compete for things like sunlight, nutrients, and water. And most people don't know that a pine tree in the Rocky Mountains will suck 200 to 300 gallons of water out of the ground a day. And when you have 50 or 60 to the acre that are sucking that kind of water out, that's one thing. When you get 500 or 600 to the acre, that's another thing. And when a tree gets stressed, they give off a pheromone that only bugs can smell. And in my area, the northern pine beetle, which is a natural occurring bug, has smelled the stress of millions of acres, and they've moved in and killed the trees. That's the same drainage, and those red trees are dead trees. We now have 193 million acres in the West, federally owned timberland that is overstocked and unhealthy. It doesn't need to be that way. We could remove some of the trees, leave the bigger trees, just like the Native Americans did, and turn those trees into consumable products for the most consumptive society on earth so they can have boards for their homes and furniture and wood pellets. And then we could introduce low ground-hugging fire to the forest ecosystem and do good things with the soil, invigorate the topsoil, pop open the cones of the lodgepole pine tree to plant the next crop. Fire is natural and good when it's on the ground. But what we've got going on in the West now is we have what's called fuel ladders. The fire doesn't stay on the ground. It climbs up those trees that have not been removed, gets into the canopy, and we end up with stand destroying fires, not stand regenerating fires. This year, 1.2 million acres of Montana burned up. That was a bad summer for the habitat for elk, grizzly bears, moose, bad summer for our watersheds, and a bad summer for doing things like we're told we should be looking to, like tourism. It's tough to sell postcards when that's going on in the background. Something is wrong. And what we learned the hard way is the public's truth is not defined by our reality. It's defined by the public's perception of reality. And Will Rogers was right. He once said, it ain't what you don't know that's a problem. It's what you know that ain't so that's a problem. And America knows a lot that just ain't so about forestry. In fact, when they run the information that they're getting from Disney and from Hollywood through their lens, they don't have a ground-based reality to compare it to. In fact, what they've got is 50 years of Bambi under their belt. They think before we showed up in places like Montana, wolves were raising orphaned rabbits in a sea of old growth. They have no idea that in the real world, the wolf eats the rabbit and they don't have a party right after that. But they've been sold this Disney-esque ecotopia of harmony and balance that used to exist before icky old humans showed up. They've been taught that nature is inherently benign and good, and man is inherently evil and a destroyer of the environment. 50 years of that stuff they've had. Into that mix, with the public thinking that we were destroying the environment, we started seeing lawsuits against forestry. Lawsuits by the conflict industry. In our area, it was Jasper Carlton with the Fund for Animals out of Boulder, Colorado. He phoned the Forest Service up and said, I'd like to stop all logging. I'd like to see your area managed as an international peace park. So we started filing lawsuits under the Endangered Species Act. He identified first the grizzly bear that he was going to sue representing in order to stop logging. That made me question his environmental credentials. I'm on the grizzly bear recovery team, and I understand that grizzly bears don't eat trees. And if we aren't removing the trees, then nature's going to with fire, catastrophically huge grizzly bear burning fires. He didn't care, though. He wanted to stop logging. He's part of the conflict industry, and he told the Forest Service if the grizzly bear lawsuit doesn't stop logging, then I'm going to represent the bank-hugging monkey flower, the bastard flax, the Coeur d'Alene salamander, the northern caribou. He had 12 species, 12 lawsuits, and we pay them to sue. Most Americans don't know that we have a law called Equal Access to Justice. It was passed during the Carter administration to allow the Vietnam vet to sue the Veterans Administration, David taking on Goliath, and they could take their question of federal actions that were causing them harm to a federal judge, and if the judge determined that their argument had a validity, he would pay their court costs and attorney fees. That was modified during the Reagan administration to include groups representing individuals, and the environmental conflict industry was started. They learned that they could sue the federal government on forest management and have their attorneys paid. So when that was modified, when Equal Access to Justice was changed, they held the first environmental law conference at the University of Oregon. 1,200 attorneys showed up, and they invented the spotted owl. That was my first introduction to equal access to justice and the conflict industry. And because of their efforts, we're now crossing the thin line between environmental sensitivity and environmental insanity in our rural areas. And timber's no longer alone. We were the first, but something's wrong when mining reform should be a promise of clean water and clean air while we provide strategically important metals and minerals for the most consumptive society on Earth, and instead is used as a bludgeoning device to drive mining companies out of places like Colorado and into places like Paraguay or Peru. Something's wrong when grazing reform should be a promise of good forage, clean water for future ranching families. It should not be driving ranchers out of places like New Mexico and into places like Brazil. We are crossing the thin line, and we were just first. And America doesn't even know it. They want things like cheap gas. They just don't like oil drilling. They want things like cell phones and gold furniture or jewelry. They just don't like mining. They love their wooden houses. They use paper like never before. They just don't like stumps. They want their Big Mac with no cows killed. They have no idea how all of this stuff works. So we were first. Our social license was debated. We lost it. But now your social license in the rest of rural America, whether it's in mining or fishing or farming, your social license is being debated at kitchen tables around the country. If we're going to save that license, we have to understand how we got here. Because if we're going to turn a corner, we have to understand how we got to where we're at. And I go back to the 1960s. The 1960s, the most incredibly important thing that happened to us, I believe, is we got the television, the boob tube, and we pushed that sucker from in the living room close enough to the dining room so we could watch Walter Cronkite while we ate. And I was just a kid in Montana, and I got to see this scene on my TV. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire and burned for a week through Cleveland. And I wasn't very old, but I remember thinking, rivers should not burn their bridges up. We should have a law against that. You didn't have to live there to see it going on in real time. We got to see the Great Lakes, fish swimming wrong side up every night. We got to see the Los Angeles airshed turning purple. And then from a spaceship almost to the moon, we got to see our little blue ball called Earth from a distance. And we figured out that we only have one planet, we're only getting one planet, and some of the stuff we were doing to it needed to stop. So we joined in factor and spirit the American environmental movement. We empowered groups like the Sierra Club in Audubon and Wilderness Society. If a group didn't exist, we started one. I led the first Earth Day in Libby. We picked up crap in the creek going by the middle school. We joined the movement to get laws on the books, and we got some good, well-intended laws. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Wilderness Act. Good, well-intended laws designed to take care of home. But those laws and the movement are 40, 50 years old, and they're showing their age. The laws have been bastardized through regulatory regimes and judicial activism until they don't even resemble what they were supposed to be. The Clean Water Act was to be a promise to the American farmer, not a threat. The Endangered Species Act was to protect species from human-caused extirpation. It wasn't supposed to be a social engineering device for a lunatic in Boulder to smear Libby off the map. And the movement's alive. The movement is you as young ranchers going to the annual convention and learning how to be a little bit better at doing what you do, incrementally doing a better job of providing for humans and protecting the environment and taking care of your animals. That's the real environmental movement. It's me driving to town in my Ford EcoBoost engine. It's Caterpillar and Shell getting together and developing a diesel engine that if you park the sucker in the Los Angeles airshed, the air going in is dirtier than the air coming out. That's the real movement. But some of the leaders of the old movement learned some really important lessons early on. They hijacked the social movement and turned it into an industry that is completely dependent upon crisis and conflict and making money. They turned what was a social movement into the eco-conflict industry, and they're really good at what they do. And we inadvertently participated in their business strategy and didn't even know it. What did we do early on? We knew that they were excellent marketers of a 3-word vision of stop doing that, but we thought we had the truth on our side, and we made some assumptions. But what they started doing was presenting to the American public some pretty bleak choices. They're still using the tube, only now it's not just the tube, it's also their iPad, your smartphone, the computer screen, 200 channels on satellite, and they boil our very complex rural commodity discussion into 2 really easy choices with visual backdrops. If they're going to talk about timber, I know the first 20 seconds of the evening news is going to be the picture on the left, the world's butt ugliest clear cut. You can see the sucker from the moon. And they show that to the American public, and that's forestry. And the next 20 seconds is going to be somebody who wants to save the forest. And they get a babbling brook and a pristine mountain scene. And they say, all I want is to protect the forest. I want to save the forest for my children. And they point out that everybody in that last soundbite are greedy corporate bastards intent on profit alone. And that's the end of the newscast. 2 20-second things, and America gets to pick. And if you thought those were the things you had to pick from, which would you rather have? And every industry is treated the same. Talk to a fifth grader about what oil looks like, and they'll begin defining dead black birds in the dead black Gulf. The BP oil spill is oil, and the guy who doesn't like it stands in front of a white sandy beach, and all he wants to do is save the earth, and America gets to pick. What about mining? Mining is a yellow river. Those are mistakes that were made 100 years ago, but it doesn't matter. The guy who doesn't like mining and wants to stop it gets to show the babbling brook. And which would you rather have? What about agriculture? Watch any evening news program where they're talking about production agriculture, and they'll show a crop duster. And the people who don't like that, they'll show pretty pictures of pretty food. It's organic. Which would you rather have? And what about you guys? How many of you have seen the YouTube video of the black and white spotted cow with the forklift to its side? America has. That's animal agriculture, and the guy who doesn't like it is Wayne Pacelli with the Humane Society, and all he wants to do is save the puppy, and America gets to pick. And it makes us angry, because those aren't the only choices. Those are the two extremes. But the public doesn't know this. The public is 4 generations from the farm. They have no natural resource linkage except the Disney Channel. They have no idea where their stuff comes from. And we've laughed at them. How many times have we said things like, the silly people in the city think milk comes from a carton at Safeway? The timber industry, we say those stupid people in Seattle think boards just show up at Home Depot. On sale day, a bunch of boards show up. In fact, we don't believe we have many legs up on our urban cousins, but we dang well know where their stuff comes from. But it's no longer funny. It's a fertile marketplace for the fear-mongering of the conflict industry. They've learned how to sell that fear. They've learned how to market to the public and make them fearful about what the future is going to be if they don't send them money. And not understanding how that marketplace works with the conflict industry, timber communities, and that means me, we reacted poorly. What did we do? I made a list of things. Our early thoughts and actions when we first faced this. First thing we thought was, well, it's crazy in California, all right, but they invented crazy in California. It can't get that crazy here in Montana. We're common sense folks. Then we learned that crazy was portable. You can move it around. I thought, well, it's a pendulum thing. Society often goes through these swings. It'll find the middle again. Yeah, it's out there in the extreme. But then we learned that it's not a pendulum thing. People believe they're making moral and ethical decisions based on this stuff. And if we don't help the pendulum come back, it will permanently move on us. It's not going to find the middle on its own. So I thought, well, our jobs matter. Timber was the second largest industry in Montana. There's no way they'd just write us off. Then we found out our jobs don't matter. Their jobs matter to them, but if our jobs are costing them their clean air, clean water, and environmental future, our jobs have to go. That's what they told us. I thought, well, it's our association's job. I belong to the Montana Logging Association, and I'm busy working. And I'd go to a quarterly meeting or an annual meeting and ask Keith Olson how the heck things are going. But I pay my dues, and I'm too busy to be engaged. I pay them to do this stuff. It's their job. We saddled them with the impossible task of representing us without us being fully weighed in. I thought, well, that's okay. Our truth is going to win anyway. Then we learned the bad reality about truth. It's a movable goalpost based on perceptions. So then we started saying, well, we need to tell them the real truth. And we started what I call reverse jeopardy. We had a guy from France come over to America. His name was Dr. Rapai. He met with the timber industry advertising folks, and he said, you know what? You need to show people not the production process, because that's icky, but show them the final product that they buy and have a woman point at it. So we had women pointing at Anderson windows on TV, moting Mother Earth, and telling people that wood was good, as if that was ever a problem. At that time, we had the highest commodity prices in history. People were buying the wood, and we were pointing at windows, and we spent $40 million on a wood is good campaign that completely missed the mark. We were answering all the questions the public wasn't asking. They were buying our stuff. They just believed that stumps sucked. And we left the entire discussion of the stump up to the conflict industry. So then we sued the bastards. We've got rights too, you know. And we won a few of our early lawsuits. It took us a while to figure out that we were winning in the court of law, but losing in the court of public opinion. And ultimately, the court of law defines, or the court of public opinion defines the court of law. So then we took to the streets. Convoys, rallies, 80 miles of logging trucks bottling up I-5, 15,000 people in downtown Seattle. I was in the lead truck, and I was the guy with the bullhorn, until we figured out that we were the third ring of a three-ring circus, and somebody else was taking the gate receipts. We were the tit for the conflict industry's tat. We drove the story to the front page of newspapers around America, where the conflict industry got to ask America, do you want the marching Neanderthals to whack all the trees down, or do you want to send us $20 and we'll save the forest? Without even knowing it, we made the eco-conflict industry billions of dollars by participating in their business strategy. So we finally backed up. We figured out that for far too long we were fighting, but we weren't leading. And fighting was making the conflict industry money, and it was leading to our demise. And we learned the real enemy. And the real enemy is ignorance. And it's not just the public's ignorance, it's also ours. What we began to learn in the timber industry was how to lead this discussion. Three of the things we learned the hard way. One truth we learned was democracy works, but it's not a spectator sport. We needed to be engaged. We also learned that when people lead, leaders follow. Our leaders know very little about what a solution might look like that works on the ground. We had to lead them to that. And we learned the world is run by those who show up. In Phoenix, at the annual meeting, I'm going to go into these in more detail. What you can do, what the young ranchers can do to engage in those three truths. Tonight I want to talk about what we learned in developing a strategy that worked for us instead of just responding to and participating in the strategy of the conflict industry. Because what we found out was we were part of their strategy. They knew how we would respond, and they built their strategy on that known response. So what we finally learned was that when we were attacked, we had to ask ourselves, what reaction does the conflict industry want us to take to further their strategy? Because they built their business plan on known reactions from the timber industry. So every time they came at us, we'd ask, what do they want us to do? And then we try really hard to deliver a response that doesn't just feed them, but leads towards a solution for us and for the public. And when we started to do that, when we started to figure out how we could get beyond participating in their strategy, we then had to learn what makes people actually take action for us. Because the freedom to operate requires that society go beyond liking us and assist us by taking the next step, acting. People like us. People like ranchers. In fact, we are so disconnected from the rest of society, they watch us like they do a Disney movie. How many of you have watched Axeman? It's primetime television now. It's not truthful, it's reality TV, and it shows the ugly sides, but they're so interested in us. Axeman was a hit. Deadliest Catch is a hit. The Galt ranching family in Montana had an evening primetime show. So they like us. It's just how do we get them to take the next step and act for us? Because they'll like us to death. I talked to a guy from the University of Washington, and he showed me this diagram. He said to get somebody to act for you, 3 things have to intersect. What you want them to do has to be possible. It has to be acceptable. The public has to say, yeah, you can do that. And it has to be gainful. Everything we do as humans we act when these 3 things intersect. I encourage you to think about things like taking your kids to McDonald's. Is it because you love to eat there? No, well, it's possible to eat there. It's acceptable to eat there. And the gainfulness is you have happy kids. Everything we do, the best of humankind, philanthropy and things like that, happen because people are doing it because they get something out of it. We've got to figure out in our discussion what's in it for the public, what's possible for us to do, what's acceptable for us to do, and what gives the public what they think they need, what's gainful for them. What are they going to get out of backing you? And when we talk about that, they need, when we're talking to them about what's in it for them, they need to hear that from somebody they trust, and they want some certainty. What they really want, what the public needs from us. They need to hear what's gainful and acting for us, and they need the truth, warts, pimples, and all. They need it from somebody they trust, and they want transparency, accountability. They want to look under our kilt. We need to figure out how to deliver that to them in order to avoid playing in to the conflict industry's strategy. What can you do to help? How can you avoid participating in the conflict industry strategy? I developed a thing I call HELP, and the H stands for humanize, the E is empathize and educate, the L is for lead, and the P is for participate. I'm going to go over those real quickly. What do I mean by humanize? The conflict industry understands that right now the social norm is to vilify industry. Used to be really cool to be called an industrious young man. Well, industry has been vilified for a generation now. It's why when Wayne Pacelli is talking about ranching issues, he can stick factory farm and agribusiness 6 times in every paragraph. He knows where that hits the public. They've done their focus groups. They've done their message development. They know that hits the public in a bad place. They understand that that's the norm. Now we can try to climb that hill, or we can just understand that our culture needs a human face. We need to humanize this discussion. We need to we need a human face to share the story over the backyard fence. And that face is yours. They need to hear from you. They need to hear from us. They don't need to hear from a 3-piece suit and tie talking head. They want to hear from their friends. The new backyard fence, by the way, is social media, Facebook, Twitter. People get 73% of the information they get for basing their opinions comes from social media because they believe they can trust their 1,500 friends on Facebook. We need to be over their backyard fence. We need our face, your face. And once we're talking to them, we need to do something that in the timber industry we sucked at until we figured it out. The E we thought stood for educate. So we stood on street corners and screamed our truth. But we needed to first empathize, because we needed to understand the concerns of the public. What do they think are the real issues? It doesn't matter what we think. What do they think? They're the ones that give us the consent to operate. And it doesn't matter if we think they're crazy. Their issues are real to them. So what do they think is really going on? And if we're crafting a solution, what's acceptable to them? It doesn't matter if we think what they're thinking is crazy. We'd better be able to craft a solution that's acceptable to them. Part of that is engaging in, owning, showcasing environmental and food safety initiatives. For the public, the issue that's gainful for them is to have a healthy environment and safe food. And in animal agriculture, they want to be sure that the beef they're eating came from a place where the animals are treated fairly. So we need to own on the ranch and in the home clean air and water efforts, animal welfare efforts, individual and industry-wide regulatory initiatives. We need to own those things because the issue is the environment and the issue is animal welfare to the public. So we'd better be the leader of those discussions. I call it out-greening the posers, because they claim to care about these things, but what they really care about is generating income. What they really care about is scaring the public out of $20 a year. What we care about is a solution that really does take care of the environment and our animals. And in that discussion, not only is it okay to be green, the public demands it. So we should proudly wear our environmental credentials. And then we can start educating. Our message to assure the public the way we maintain our social license is to convince them that I'm listening, I understand, I respect or I share your concerns, and I'm part of the answer to those concerns. Notice there's nothing in there about agreeing. Doesn't matter if we agree. What they want to know, what the public demands is, are you listening? Do you understand? Do you respect who they are? And are you a part of the answer to my problems? Is it gainful for me to support you? When we can deliver that message to the public, our license is maintained and the conflict industry can't get traction. Once we've let the public know that we're listening, then we can start to educate. We have to listen and hear, and we can't be tone deaf. That means turning them off because we think they don't know. I was going to say a bad word. They don't know anything. We have to listen respectfully. We can't play reverse jeopardy, demanding that they listen to what we have to tell them. We have to listen to them and then answer the questions they're asking, not give them the answers to questions we think they ought to be asking. We need to identify and address individual and societal questions, concerns, and needs. And when we address those concerns, we have to communicate those answers to their perceived questions, concerns, and need. And we need to communicate it in understandable English. When we start figuring out, well, the public doesn't have the right information and they want their forest to be saved, we started throwing white papers at them. Well, they don't understand that crap. They understand the basics. We need to give them answers and language that they can understand, or we'll completely miss the mark. And then we need to watch our language. It was really easy in the early days when I found out about the conflict industry to call them greenies and tree huggers. And we finally came to understand that the public thinks they are public interest groups. We know they're not. They're self-interest groups, but the public identifies with them. And we pretend the public doesn't, or we can be careful with our language. And what the conflict industry has done is they've not been tone deaf. They've heard what the public is asking, and they play into their fears about what's going on in the world around them. What we need to do is not shoot the horse. We need to knock the rider out of the saddle. We need to be careful with our language, be proud to be green, be proud to be an environmentalist. We oftentimes say we're the true environmentalists, and then in the same conversation we'll call them dinks, those stupid environmental wackos. Every time we do that, the public turns us off because they're self-identifying with them. So we need to watch our language. Then we can educate. But remember, packaging of our truths is often as important as the content of our truths, because conclusions humans draw have a hard-driven emotional component. That's what the conflict industry plays into. And we get mad about it because they're not listening to science and reality. They're all being emotional. But so are we. I got to know Nicole Widmar. She's a professor at Purdue University, one of the gals I co-wrote a book with. She shows a couple slides to drive this point home. That's a Dodge. I had to hunt to find a picture of of that Dodge, but it's a quad cab, Hemi, beautiful pink Barbie edition. Ask yourself, if that was on the showroom floor, would you go look at it? It's the Barbie edition. If that was on the showroom floor, would you go look at it? Quad cab, Hemi engine, steel gray. We make emotional decisions all the time. It's the same science in those pickups. It's packaged differently. And we need to be careful, but because if we're not careful, we'll be trying to sell a pink truck to the public. The L in HELP stands for lead. We need to craft and implement solutions that answer the public's questions that we can live with. This is a tough one because sometimes we have to give up some practices that the public just doesn't understand and doesn't accept. So in the timber industry, we had to give up some things in order to communicate with the public. We didn't have time to talk to them about why sometimes a clear cut makes sense. It's got 1,000 acres of dead trees. Pretending they're not all dead doesn't make much ecological sense. We couldn't convince the public cutting all the trees down in an area was good, though. So we had to give that up. So we have to craft and implement solutions that we can live with. And I can tell you, working toward your solution is better than fighting against a solution that's being shoved down your throat, because they're going to solve the issue they think is a problem. And you either help them craft the solution or they'll craft one for you. Leading also means focusing on local ambassadors. Local leadership is incredibly important. I know the National Cattlemen, there are offices in the cities, and there are programs designed to engage the American public. And thank heavens, the beef industry is decades ahead of where the timber industry was. There are plenty of tools for you to use. But before you start worrying about educating Denver and Washington, D.C. and Chicago, worry about your local media, your local schools, your local leaders. Because I can tell you, if they aren't firmly engaged on a ranch, they know as little about your business as the people in the city. They get 200 channels. The kids are getting Ranger Rick. They've got Captain Planet on satellite. So if we don't talk to our local folks, we don't have ambassadors from home that can speak to our truth. So the tools can be handed to us by our associations, but we need to take those tools home and use them in our local media, our local schools, and with our local leaders. And that brings us to the P in HELP, and it stands for participate. What I ask all rural folks to do is add one line item to their business plan for activism. Activism has long had a bad connotation in rural areas. I remember when I told my dad we had to become activists, he was welding on a dozer. It was springtime. I went out and Jasper had filed the first lawsuit, shut down a third of the forest, and I said, "Hey, Father Old Person." And I can still see him flipping his welding helmet up, smoking rod in his hand. I said, "Dad, if we're going to survive, we're going to have to become activists." And he gave me a look of horror. He was thinking grow hair to my butt and smoke pot. That isn't what activism means. Activism means taking 1 hour out of your work week, not out of your family time, not out of church time, 1 hour of work week, doing something. In Phoenix, I'm going to go over some of the things that you can do with an hour a week. What I want to encourage tonight, though, is that you place that as part of doing business, because maintaining the social license and learning how to not participate in the conflict industry strategy is critical to maintaining your social license and your freedom to operate. And activism can be easy. It can be fun. I'm going to go over that when we're in Phoenix, some of the things you can do. But it's not marching in the street and carrying pickets. It's much simpler than that. It's being engaged in the Cattlemen, in a committee, in the Young Rancher program. It's going into a local school with ag in the classroom under your arm. There are a lot of ways to participate. While you're participating, what we learn to do is at every juncture when we're beginning to take an action, we started asking ourselves, am I participating in the conflict industry strategy by feeding a fight? Or am I engaging in a strategy that's going to lead toward a solution? And believe me, it's a lot more fun to be in a fist fight because you want to take a swing at somebody. So our convoys and rallies, and there are times when that is appropriate. There are times when we need to stand up and have our voice heard. But lots of times it just makes us feel good and feeds them. So at every juncture, we had to ask ourselves, am I feeding a fight or am I engaging in my strategy that's going to lead toward my solution? And that's tough, but ask yourself that. We learned some things like how to define a solution. When we finally listened to the public, what we heard is they wanted a healthy forest. Well, there's Kismet, so did we. And then we started listening to what they thought a healthy forest looked like. And we started backing away from that goalpost of common ground. We started building stakeholder groups locally with people that were fist fighting prior to us getting together around a table and talking about what a healthy forest might look like. And then we started promoting some policy that would get us toward a healthy forest. And that culminated in George Bush signing the Healthy Forest Initiative, the most progressive forest language since Teddy Roosevelt. It's going to take decades to get it implemented. We've got to regain the trust of the public because we lost our social license. But it will work. It's not perfect, but we can get there. And for me, it's the light at the end of the tunnel for our rural communities. Every summer, we get to smell the smoke of failure as 193 million acres tries to burn down. But the public understands that we've heard them, and we're working towards a solution that is acceptable to them. That light at the end of our tunnel, though, is a train coming right at you. Because our piñata, the conflict industry has to have a piñata they can beat on to make money. And for years, Save the Forest generated cash. It's not anymore. People are smelling the smoke. People are seeing the forest burn. They want a healthy forest, and it's not a profit center for the conflict industry anymore. The next profit centers, I believe, are going to be anything that has to do with water and anything that has to do with animals. And that's you guys. So hopefully you won't have to learn the tough way the lessons we learned. We also learned how to not participate. Bonnie Raitt did a concert. By not participate, I mean not participating in their strategy. Bonnie Raitt did a concert in Southern Oregon years ago to stop logging. And we showed up with logging trucks, and we had picketers, and we had kids on the street, save my daddy's job. And we made sure everybody in Oregon knew that Bonnie was there. We sold her a lot of tickets. Didn't do a thing for us. And then she decided to come to Montana. She was going to stop a mining operation in Montana. And the mining company called me and said, Bonnie Raitt's coming. And I know you guys have dealt with her before. We need to have a convoy. We need to have a rally. And I said, you know what? That made her money. It didn't do crap for us. I said, how about if we do something different? It was to think about what they want us to do and do something different. So I said, how about if you send Bonnie an invitation to the mine? Bet she's never been to one. And send that invitation to Good Morning America, to Fox News, to CNN. And they said, well, she won't come. I said, well, she'll have to if you send it to those people and say you've invited her to come to the mine she wants to stop. And sure enough, she came. And we had national news there, and they said, oh, my heavens, she's going to come. We need to show her a video of what we're going to do. And I said, no, that's what she wants. What she's going to do is stand on the hill with her steel guitar and say she's not opposed to mining. She just doesn't want it to happen here. So I said, why don't you have a map and have her point to where she'd like it to happen and suggest that there be an ore body there? It makes mining more profitable that way. So I said, and then listen to her. If she's got any valid points, answer her questions on the news. And in the meantime, she did have a concert. It cost $28 a ticket at that time. I said, why don't we do an evening in Jorgensen's hotel in the basement, And we put full-page ads in the paper and said, you can go rub elbows with the Stop Doing That crowd at Bonnie Raitt's concert, or for $5 and a bag of food, you can come to the basement of Jorgensen's, rub elbows with miners who are trying to figure out how to do that and do it correctly, and we'll play Bonnie's music because she's a great singer. We ended up with 1,500 people showing up in the basement. We stole all the media. We were the good news story, 6 tons of food and $5,000. So we didn't participate in their strategy. We developed one of our own that shared our news. We also learned how to get one step ahead of these folks. I don't know how many of you saw Mount Polly. It was a mine up in Canada, and the tailings pound blew out. And when we saw that, we thought, oh man, we know what the conflict industry is going to do with that. They're going to say all mines are going to blow out and it's going to be terrible, like the one down at the Four Corners. So we got together with the mining industry and we said, what can you craft as a solution to this? And Montana, my son is a state senator. He worked with the mining industry, the state agencies, and we developed the toughest mine tailings legislation in the world and had it passed within 8 months. So we can look the people of Montana in the eye and say, you know what, that can never happen here. That's getting in front of the conflict industry. We knew what they were going to do with that story. We got in front of it before they did. The other thing we learned was how to humanize. We have a program, I'll go over that when we're in Phoenix. It's called Provider Pals. It's where classrooms are adopting farmers and ranchers and miners and fishermen and communicating with the kids in middle schools all over the country, introducing them to our culture because they want to meet us. They have no idea who we are, but they want to meet us. That brings me to my conclusion. Society is ready. They're tired of the conflict industry. They're tired of the doom and gloom, bongo drum beating, incense burning, planet is dying crap that they have been getting since they were 5. They're tired of hearing what's wrong. And that's all the conflict industry has to sell is what's wrong. They're ready to start hearing about what can be right. And I know it from my speaking. It used to be, all my speaking was the choir. It was farming groups and ranching groups and logging groups. But now next week I'm addressing the plumbers and manufacturing industry in Napa, California. I've keynoted the American Banking Association's annual meeting. They want to hear from the ground. The National Association of Counties, the Chamber of Commerce from Las Vegas, the Chamber of Commerce from Lansing, Michigan. They want to hear from a real human, and especially the next generation. They're ready for a new vision, built on hope instead of fear, science instead of emotion, education instead of litigation, resolution instead of conflict, and employing rather than destroying human resources. They're desperate. They will not adopt anti-environmentalism, but they're tired of the conflict industry and their message. They want a new vision, and we can deliver that by not participating in the conflict industry strategy and building one of our own. In Phoenix, I'm going to go over some of this stuff and going to dig in a little bit more. I'm going to talk about why with vision there is hope. I'm really pleased to be addressing the young farmer or the young rancher leader group. You are the hope for my grandkids. And that hope means that the choice of your occupation cannot be the career of last resort, but the career that you are proud to be a part of, a proud heritage of the past, and a proud heritage to pass on to the future. And I'm going to do something called Activism 101. It's going to give you an idea of what kind of things you can do with your hour that actually will make a difference and are kind of fun to do and actually screw up the conflict industry, how to have fun with it. You don't have to participate with them. You can outride them. If you, in the meantime, that gal from Purdue and another gal from Purdue, they asked me if I'd write a book. So we co-authored a thing called Against the Odds. It's a path forward for rural America. It talks about a lot of this, what we learned in dealing with the conflict industry. You can get it on Amazon.com. In the meantime, thank you for participating. I hope to see you in Phoenix. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer, or try to.
Thank you to our presenter today, Bruce Vincent. As we move into our question and answer session, I want to invite everyone to the upcoming 2018 Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA Trade Show being held January 31st through February 2nd, 2018 in Phoenix, Arizona. This is a great opportunity to hear more extensive information on current issues and opportunities in our cattle industry, as well as help chart the course for our future. We have a great lineup of events focused on emerging leaders in the industry. Wednesday, we'll kick off the Cattlemen's College that Bruce will be speaking at a session. Wednesday afternoon, we'll have a YBL networking reception in the trade show. Thursday morning, we'll have our regional meetings followed by checkoff and policy program updates. And then that evening, we'll have a Phoenix Fiesta party. Friday, we'll have the Emerging Leaders Luncheon with Bruce. We'll have checkoff and NCBA policy subcommittee and committee meetings. And that night, we'll have the Cowboy Comedy Club and after party. Saturday, we'll wrap up the week with the board of directors meeting before we all head home. Be sure to mark your calendars and visit www.beefusa.org for more information about the upcoming meeting as well as YBL. We look forward to seeing you in Phoenix. Now I'll turn it over to Josh to moderate the question and answer session. Thank you again for participating in tonight's webinar.
Thanks, Jacob, and Bruce. Thank you both. And just waiting on some questions to be chatted in here, so we'll see what folks have for us. Bruce, you talk about there in the closing that that we want to move people from pure emotion to being able to educate and get some facts. But I guess, is it your opinion, I've heard this from other folks, but is it your opinion that you have to start with the emotion? I think you went into that a little bit in your presentation, but how do you bridge that gap and get to the facts?
Yep, you first have to listen and hear what their emotional tag is, and we have to address them with our facts that address their emotional reaction to what they believe the facts are. So that's the packaging part. We've got to make sure that we're addressing the emotional concern they have about the issue that we've got facts behind. That's why empathizing is so important, because if they don't believe we've listened to them, then there's no way we can ever touch them emotionally. But if they become convinced, or if they believe that we heard them, then that's the first emotional tag. You're listening. And then we can begin to discuss the facts, and we have to learn how to package it. But if we don't first touch them emotionally, they will never listen.
So you mentioned, that you guys obviously had a learning process in the logging industry. What are your thoughts of how to engage and who to engage with? I guess it seems like there are some folks in what I would call the conservation community that have goals that are more aligned with that of farming and ranching than others. So where do you draw the line? How do you engage the right folks, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oftentimes the right folks live with us. So our start in timber has been local. There are chapters of national groups that live in local areas and have members that have the same concerns as we do. So the national groups may have some issues because many of them are just conflict driven. But their local members belong to them because of the emotional tie to whatever the concern is. We found local chapters of the Sierra Club that are more than willing to sit down, and we've got a lot of common ground. So we work first with the local entities and trying to craft a solution that they can then telegraph up to their national counterparts. But focusing local first because the interests are in line. And then finding groups, there are many conservation groups that are in it for the right reason. They are not in it for the conflict. And that's the first question I ask. When I'm sitting around a table, with folks sharing ideas, the first thing I look at is, if we find a solution, are they threatened? Does that mean they have to go find another problem? Because if that is the case, then that's a bottomless pit, and we're probably never going to get to a real resolution. But if they're sitting around the table and they have something to gain out of our solution, then we can find common ground. There's a chapter in my book too on this, by the way, that where it used to be we thought we had to have consensus to move forward, so we could only get together with groups where we could agree on everything. And that's a recipe for paralysis. It does not work. We don't have to have consensus and agree on everything in order to find a solution. We have to collaborate. We have to find people that are committed to finding a solution. And then we have to find those areas where we can agree and move forward with those. It might not be the whole pie, but we can take bites out of pieces of the pie. So there are a number of, particularly in the timber industry, our stakeholder groups and stuff where we began defining what a healthy forest does look like. It started with little local meetings that then grew into regional meetings. They're now telegraphing the message up to their conflict industry-oriented national groups, and it's working. So I am a big believer in collaboration, not in consensus because it paralyzes, but in collaboration and finding groups that are actually have something to gain from a solution.
Great response, and thanks again for sharing a lot of wisdom with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Looks like that's all the questions we have coming in, and I know for some of us it's getting later on the East Coast, so we'll let everybody get back to what they were going to do with their evening. Thanks, Bruce, and look forward to seeing you and hopefully everybody on the call tonight and those that watch this recorded at the Cattle Industry Convention in February.
We'll see you in Phoenix.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.